Hello, my name is Sarah Nelson. I'm the Executive Director of the Christic Institute. And Americans throughout the country now are wondering what's coming with the Select Committee hearings report, which we're expecting soon. And even though some of us may not be really well informed about the issues involved in the hearings, we have a sense that it has been a limited investigation and not a really thorough and in-depth one. Today we're here to share with you information about an investigation and a litigation that the Christic Institute is engaged in on behalf of 2 U.S. journalists. And this investigation will be in-depth, it's private, and it's not restricted by political considerations that are sometimes brought to bear at the congressional level. First, before talking about the general case, I'd like to say a few words about the Christic Institute. We're an interfaith law and policy center in Washington, D.C. We are made up of Christians, both Catholic and Protestant, Jews, and some New Age people who are committed to doing public interest work on a daily basis because of our faith values. We have a history first of beginning with the Karen Silkwood case. It was the team of the people that did the Karen Silkwood case that actually founded the Institute in January of 1980. We went on to do the Greensboro Civil Rights Fund case against the Klan and the Nazis and the Greensboro police in North Carolina for the killing of demonstrators there. We also did the litigation around 3 Mile Island, keeping the company there from dumping the radioactive waste into the air and water from the contaminated container building. We did the first sanctuary defense case in Texas, which was won on appeal on Dan Sheehan's trial arguments, and he's the general counsel at the Christic Institute. And we've done a number of other cases that are addressing major public policy issues. We have recently, as I said before, begun a lawsuit against now the leadership of the Contras and the team of people that Oliver North has been working with. And this lawsuit is against 29 people, some of whom have become very visible. They are people like Richard Secord, General John Singlob, Albert Hakim, Robert Owen, Adolfo Calero, who was the head of the Contras, Theodore Shackley, Thomas Kleins, and a number of other people who have been involved in the Iranian weapons sale and also the private supplying of the Contras. The suit is on behalf of 2 U.S. journalists, Tony Abergon and Martha Honey. They're based in Costa Rica, and they have been victims of the activities of this private network, and therefore they have standing in the U.S. courts to file a suit against them. The suit is filed in Miami in the federal district court there. Chief Judge James Lawrence King is overseeing this case. We have won the motions to dismiss battle. The other side tried to dismiss this case, and Judge King gave us subpoena power and said that we should go forward with it and begin to put people under oath and question them about the history of their activities. The laws which have been applied in this suit against the 29 defendants are, we are charging them with violation of the U.S. Neutrality Act because as private citizens they've been engaging in an illegal war against Nicaragua. We have diplomatic relations with that country, and private citizens cannot engage in war activities against such a country. We are also charging them with violation of the RICO Act, the racketeering law that was designed to deal with mob businesses that are set up as fronts for racketeering activities. The racketeering activities they are charged with include massive drug smuggling into this country of heroin and now more currently cocaine, heroin from Southeast Asia and cocaine from South America. We are also charging them with basically murder incorporated through political assassination programs that they have engaged in not only this hemisphere but other places of the world as well over a period of almost 25 years. The difference between what we are saying and what has been evolving in the congressional investigations is we are talking about the history of these people not for just a period of 2 years during the Boland Amendment, but for a period of over 2 decades. And we think it's important that this information be brought to light and shared with the American people so that collectively we can bring to bear the kind of pressure that will be necessary on our institutions to solve the policy problems that are raised by this case. The story includes 3 aspects in terms of the investigation. One is a national, global investigation. Another is a Costa Rican investigation. And the story really begins in Costa Rica with Tony Abergon when he was an ABC cameraman in 1984 and with his wife Martha Honey. and their experience as victims of this private enterprise network and their investigation of it.
My name is Tony Avergan. Along with my wife, Martha Honey, I am one of the plaintiffs in the Christic Institute's lawsuit. Martha and I have been journalists for 15 years. We currently live in San Jose, Costa Rica, and have lived there for the last 4.5 years. A little over 3 years ago, I was one of the journalists who attended a news conference that was being given by troublesome Contra leader Eden Pastora at a Contra camp in southern Nicaragua, just across the border from Costa Rica. That news conference was attacked by a terrorist who posed as a journalist, brought a camera case full of C4 plastic explosive to the news conference and detonated it by remote control, and killed 3 journalists and seriously wounded some 24 others, including me. Martha, fortunately, was not at the news conference because she was finishing up an article that she was doing for the New York Times, was immediately asked by the Committee to Protect Journalists in the Newspaper Guild to begin an investigation to find out who had done this and why. When I got out of the hospital several months later, I joined that investigation. And it's a very long story, a story that is recounted in the in our what we now call the Lepenka Report, which is actually the what we ended up submitting some 16 months later to the Committee to Protect Journalists, and that's available here. And I won't go into all the details of that because I hope you'll have the chance to read it. But to make a very complicated situation somewhat brief, we began thinking that the probable suspects in this attack were probably the Sandinistas, because Eden Pastora, after all, was a Contra leader. This was in an illegal Contra camp in southern Nicaragua, and certainly the government in Nicaragua had no reason to love Eden Pastora at the time. But very soon after beginning the investigation, we noticed that there were numerous incidents of disinformation, stories being planted in the press, in most cases emanating directly from agencies of the U.S. government in Washington, and also disinformation being planted in the Costa Rican press. This, of course, caused us to wonder why people were engaged in disinformation. If they were, they obviously had something to hide, and we were interested in finding out. We spent 16 months looking at leads, many of them false leads. Much of the time was spent tracking down this disinformation. We had leads pointing to the right, pointing to the left. We conducted literally hundreds of interviews, many of them in dark alleys with drug traffickers, with mercenaries, Contras. We traveled throughout the Americas. We had people working for us in Europe. And we did a very, very thorough investigation. During the course of that investigation, towards the end of it, we had the unfortunate experience of having one of our key sources, a person who had told us that he was a member of the group that had done the bombing, was kidnapped and murdered in Costa Rica. We had another person who was cooperating with us who was harassed so badly that we had to take him and his entire family out of Costa Rica, give them new identities, and settle them in another country. And by the way, I think there was some help from some of the organizations that you're involved with in that process. It was a very difficult time. We were receiving death threats, harassment. Many of our sources were being threatened. There was a concerted campaign to try to throw us off the track or to try to scare us so that we would not continue with uncovering the information that we were uncovering. Finally, 16 months after the bombing, we felt that we had enough information to submit our report to the Committee to Protect Journalists. We also, in the course of the investigation, uncovered a lot of information about Contras and drug trafficking, because the group that we had discovered that was involved in the bombing was in fact a cell of the FDN that was being directly aided by the Central Intelligence Agency and the National Security Council, and we found proof that this very same group was heavily involved in drug trafficking, in arms sales for profit, in the violations of various United States and Costa Rican laws. We also discovered that there were agencies of the Costa Rican government, security agencies of the Costa Rican government, that had been brought under the control of the Central Intelligence Agency in Costa Rica and were more responsive to the U.S. Embassy and the Central Intelligence Agency than they were to the executive branch of the government of Costa Rica. This information, we were told by Costa Rican friends, this information was very important to the future of Costa Rica, that people in Costa Rica should know about this. And at their urging, we held a news conference in Costa Rica, made our report available, translated into Spanish, and distributed it to people in Costa Rica. Immediately, we were sued for criminal libel. Now, libel in Costa Rica is a much more serious charge than it is here in the United States. It is a criminal offense. And we were sued for criminal libel by a millionaire North American rancher by the name of John Hull, who accused us of having slandered him by saying he was a CIA agent, a drug trafficker, and a murderer. We responded that we had spent quite a few pages describing his activity, but for reasons of brevity, we would accept his summary. That case went to trial in May last year. Shortly before that, we had been talking to friends in the United States about our frustration concerning this whole case, because we were feeling certainly under attack by John Hull, by his friends, by people in the U.S. Embassy. I should mention that the day after we issued our Lapenka report, the then U.S. ambassador to Costa Rica, Louis Toms, said on Costa Rican television that we were traitors to our country. We wondered if our investigation had found out that the Sandinistas had done it, if he would have gotten on television and said we were great patriots. But we searched for the truth, we found the truth, and that made us traitors. But we were feeling frustrated because we had found in our investigation that the killing and maiming of journalists was not an accident, that it was intentional, that the people who planned this action planned it in a way that it would be blamed on the Sandinistas, and hoping that it would provoke U.S. military retaliation against the Sandinistas. We found out that they intentionally planted this bomb at a news conference with the full intention of killing journalists, because that would make the atrocity that much greater. We found out that they were planning other terrorist actions, including a bizarre scheme that I won't go into detail now about bombing the U.S. Embassy in San Jose, and all sorts of other important information, and that this group was still very active. We had actually found who the bomber was. We identified him. We found out that he was a right-wing Libyan exile who had been trained in Chile and had been recruited in Chile. And we actually, for a period of time, found where he was. We found him living in the Hialeah section of Miami. We informed the FBI of this. There was an Interpol warrant out for this person. The FBI refused to do anything. Costa Rican authorities refused to do anything. So we were feeling very, very frustrated. And we talked to friends in the United States. They suggested that there might be an alternative, and that would be to file a civil suit in federal court in the United States. Just when we were discussing this, we received a phone call, an excited phone call from Danny Sheehan and people at the Christic Institute saying we had to talk, we had to get together. And we agreed to do that. They came to Costa Rica and explained that they had also been involved in an investigation. We didn't know who they were, and we had frankly never heard of the Christic Institute. But they explained they had been involved in an investigation of a group of people who were ex-officials of the Central Intelligence Agency, ex-generals, and people who have been engaged in a whole series of covert activities over a period of decades, and that their investigation had led them to Lapenka and connections with some of the very same people that we have been investigating, and particularly down to John Hull. When we put all of our information together, we were also excited because we found that they had begun in Washington with the people wearing the suits and worked their way down and ended up with John Ho. We had begun in the gutter with the Contras and the drug dealers and worked our way up to John Ho, although that's not very far up. But when we got together, we saw that we had information that fit together very well. This, two parts of this completed a puzzle, and we were all very excited, but we felt that first we had to deal with this problem of the libel suit in Costa Rica. And Danny and other people from the Christic Institute helped us to view that libel suit in a new light. We were feeling under attack, and we had contacted we had retained one of the top criminal lawyers in Costa Rica. He was telling us that we had to, this was very serious, we were in a very weak position, that indeed we had libeled John Ho, and that we had better find some way to get out of this. He even suggested we look for some technicality, like try to find that they had put the stamps on a piece of paper upside down and find some small technical mistake they had made as a way of getting out. He suggested that we say that only one of us wrote the report, and we had written that on some island that doesn't belong to anybody, maybe in the Gulf of Sidra where it's disputed or something like that. We explained that we didn't want to do that, that we wanted vindication, that our reputations were at stake, and we wanted to win this and clear our reputations. Danny said this was the tack being taken by this Costa Rican lawyer was completely wrong, that really what we had here was a golden opportunity because John Ho had made a serious mistake. He was going to bring this matter into court, and it was a fantastic opportunity that we would have to air everything publicly, and really we should take advantage of this and just turn the whole thing around and make it a trial of John Ho and his activities. We fired that lawyer. We found another lawyer who shared that perspective, and we went to court and did just that. We put the CIA, John Ho, and the Contras on trial. And it was really an amazing process that took place in that Costa Rican courtroom, because right from the beginning, what happened was that the issue became not what we had said about John Ho, but really the issue was the sovereignty of Costa Rica and the question of whether there was a government and agencies of that government, being the United States government, that were running rampant over the sovereignty of a country that was striving to be neutral and stay out of the turmoil of Central America. And the judge, you could just see his eyes just kept getting wider and wider, and guards from all over the building kept coming in to hear the testimony that was being given. And it was testimony from Contras, ex-Contras, from a United States government attorney who had done some investigation on this, from Eden Pastora, and very startling testimony, things that had never been said publicly in Costa Rica before. And at the end of the trial, the judge ruled that we were perfectly justified in saying everything that we had said. John Ho then obviously was upset. He appealed that to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court upheld the lower court's decision, and we felt good about that. But also, for the reasons I explained a moment ago, we were feeling frustrated. And Danny and other people at the Christic Institute talked to us about the possibility of entering a suit in the United States as a way to air this issue and bring these people finally to justice. Martha and I were very reluctant to do that. We saw that as journalists, especially as freelance journalists, people who were not receiving a weekly paycheck from anyone but were paid by the work we do each day, that we would have serious problems because we knew that it would be perceived by some as moving across a line, an imaginary line that exists separating journalism from activism. And we knew it would not do our careers any good at all. But on the other hand, we felt a real obligation to the victims of Lepenka. We had friends, have friends, who lost arms, legs, and eyes, people we see every day. We had the 3 people that were killed were all good friends of ours. We certainly felt an obligation to them, to their families who are left alone, have no means of income. And we felt an obligation to journalists at large, because what we had found was an act of terrorism directed against members of our profession. And if that goes unanswered, it's sending out a message that said you can mess with journalists in this way, you can kill and maim them with no response, no consequence. And also, having been victims of this, solidified our thinking about terrorism. It removed the issue of terrorism from the abstract and made us think hard about it, and we realized that if there is an act of terrorism like this, and it goes unpunished, it does encourage those very same people to commit more acts of terrorism. So we really had an obligation to society at large on that, in that way. And when balancing all of these things, we felt that our obligations outweighed the consequences to our careers, and we agreed to go ahead with this suit. The suit was filed just 1 year ago, and quite honestly, as Danny will explain in a moment, a lot of people, even our friends, said you're dreaming, you're going too far. It's one thing to avenge the Lepenka bombing, but now you're talking about some sort of conspiracy involving all sorts of other people. You're bringing drug trafficking into it. You're bringing arms trafficking into it, terrorism, all these other related issues, and it's just never going to hold up. And a lot of even friends laughed about it, and they said, "Who are these people? You know, these people that you're suing. Who is General Secord? Who is Albert Hakim? Who are General Singlab?" All these names that people didn't know at the time, Robbo and John Hull. All these names that people didn't know a year ago, but now, of course, everyone knows because of the very same people that are appearing on television every day and being mildly questioned by members of the United States Congress. The filing of the suit further enraged the people who were harassing us. Lawyers from the Christic Institute were present, and we had gotten some very, very important information. Information of sworn testimony that is available here from, for instance, a Costa Rican security agent, an ex-member of the Costa Rican Intelligence Service, who testified that he had, on orders from his superiors, assisted John Hull and the Lepenka bomber several weeks before the bombing. And that is very, very important information, important here and especially important in Costa Rica. Eden Pastora gave the first full, honest, non-self-serving account of his relationship with the Central Intelligence Agency over the years. He gave 8 hours of testimony that is a very, very important record of the attempts of the CIA to destroy his organization. And all of this infuriated the people who are upset about our suit. At the end of the suit, our secretary went to the post office to pick up several packages that had arrived. One of those packages contained 2 books mailed from Nicaragua with the return address of T. Borge, Managua. And when she walked out of the post office, she was seized by narcotics police. They took her before a judge, opened up the books, and found in one of the books a packet of 50 grams of cocaine with a letter to us from Thomas Borge, the Interior Minister of Nicaragua, implicating us in large-scale cocaine trafficking, implicating Daniel Ortega, the president of Nicaragua, Humberto Ortega, the defense minister of Nicaragua, implicating the Christic Institute, investigators for the Christic Institute, Senator John Kerry, and the Soviet Union's ambassador to Costa Rica, and our Costa Rican lawyer, all in very, very large-scale drug trafficking. I mean, the letter was really, I mean, people here that see it in the United States laugh and say they overplayed their hand, and they certainly did. But in Costa Rica, it was taken seriously, and our house and office were raided by narcotics agents who burst in with their guns drawn, and there was a very tense time, and that problem is continuing. People who gave testimony, who gave those depositions, are almost all of them at this moment being harassed in one way or another in Costa Rica. And there's a general attempt to cast everyone who is involved with this as some type of common criminal, from us to being cocaine traffickers to all the people who gave depositions. And this is the tactic that they are following. We have been amazed at how often our work and the lawsuit have been mentioned in the congressional hearings. It hasn't been reported in the papers, but almost every day in the hearings over the last few weeks, there has been some mention of this lawsuit, always in a very negative way. But this is an indication, it's proof that they are afraid, that they fear this, that we have gotten to the heart of the matter. The most telling information that we have gotten to the heart of the matter came with the testimony of Colonel Dutton last week. He was asked what a certain reference he had written on a memo to the RC Corporation meant. And he explained that the RC Corporation was a phony corporation that they had created to try to feed false information to Martha Honey and Tony Avirgan to get them to drop Colonel North and Rob Owen from their lawsuit. And he explained that they had suspected that we were getting information from Max Gomez or Felix Rodriguez, the CIA person who was running the air supply operation out of Ilopango Air Base in El Salvador. They had suspected that he was leaking information to us. So they created a false corporation, created false documents, saying that North and Owen had withdrawn from the operation, and made sure that these fell into the hands of Rodriguez. And then they waited to see if we would report that or that would affect the progress of our lawsuit and if we would drop these people from the suit. It didn't work, obviously, but we took it as a compliment. They're admitting that we have some inside information, some very, very well-placed sources at the center of their operation. And as a matter of fact, we do have their operation well-pegged. We do know exactly what's going on, and the lawsuit has pinpointed those activities, and that's what has them absolutely terrified. And we know that as this thing progresses, and so far it's progressing very, very well, we know that the problems for all of us are going to increase, because as these people get pushed harder, as they get pushed harder up against the wall, and that's exactly what's happening to them, they are going to respond by attacking us, attacking the Christic Institute, attacking this whole process. And that's why we think it's important to talk to people like you about it, because we know that the best protection that we all have is to have broad public knowledge about what is going on. We really need that. If we remain isolated, if we remain anonymous, we are in danger. If the process remains isolated and anonymous, the process is going to be in danger. And our only protection, our only salvation, is to have broad public knowledge, the support of concerned individuals and organizations throughout the United States and throughout the world. And that's what's going to make the protection that's going to allow this to go forward and hopefully, surely, bring these people finally to justice.
As you've just heard from Tony Avirgan, the bombing of the Eden Pastora press conference in May of 1984 triggered a major series of events in Costa Rica, which led to the investigation by Martha Honey and Tony Avirgan. We were contacted at the Christic Institute in the fall of 1985 because Martha Honey and Tony Avirgan had been told that the Christic Institute had developed information earlier on that related to what had happened in Costa Rica, that we were aware of some of the activities of John Hull and some of the other people that had been working with them to supply the military equipment to his ranch for the Contras on the Southern Front. For that reason, we were contacted in the fall of 1985. We went in to see Martha and Tony, began to explore with them the evidence that they had, and began to share with them the information that we had developed up to that point in time. And I've been asked this evening to share that information with you preliminarily so that you can understand what it is that we knew at the time Martha and Tony contacted us in the fall of 1985. What we had discovered at the Christic Institute briefly was that we had been involved in defending the first people arrested in the sanctuary movement. They were workers for Bishop John Fitzpatrick, a Catholic bishop down in Brownsville, Texas. A group of people had been arrested, a Catholic nun, Sister Diane Mullenkamp, a lay worker at Casa Romero down there, Stacy Merck, and a journalist from the Dallas Times-Herald, Jack Fisher. they'd been picked up bringing 2 Salvadorian refugees up from southern Texas up to San Antonio, where they could apply for political asylum under the new Refugee Act of 1980. We had discovered in our investigation that the Immigration and Naturalization Service in the Southern District of Texas had been refusing to obey the Immigration and Naturalization Act under the Reagan administration. Anyone who came in and who applied for political asylum under the law was merely being arrested and incarcerated in the court alone and being deported in total violation of the law. This was the first direct manifestation we had of the Reagan administration's complete defiance and lack of regard for the law at that stage. But while we were engaged in doing the investigation, trying to find out why the Justice Department under President Reagan was defying the Congress in not obeying the Refugee Act, we discovered that part of the motivation on the part of the Justice Department personnel down in southern Texas was that they were receiving communications from FBI agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, as were some of the ministers in the valley down there, not to allow the sanctuary movement to function down there, because the FBI agents asserted the sanctuary movement was being used as a cover operation for smuggling known communist terrorists into the United States, and that if President Reagan found it necessary to launch a direct U.S. military intervention into Central America, either into El Salvador or Nicaragua, using U.S. military personnel, that these 400,000 undocumented Central American aliens that had come in from Guatemala and from El Salvador would constitute a potential threat to the national security of the United States, since we'd be engaged in military operations in Central America. Very analogous, of course, to the Japanese Americans back during World War II, except, of course, in this case, it was the United States that was doing the direct military attacking. And we discovered that the Reagan administration had, in fact, allowed and authorized a major readiness exercise to be undertaken, a military readiness exercise here in the United States. There was supposed to be a practice session to practice what might be done here in the United States if the president decided he had to launch a military strike into Central America. This readiness exercise was codenamed Rex 84, and it was authorized through a National Security Decision Directive signed by President Reagan in April of 1984. We learned that one of the major operations that was going to be practiced was a code-named operation called Rex 84. Pursuant to that readiness exercise, they were going to test through the national government under a group called the Federal Emergency Management Agency. We're going to test the feasibility of rounding up 400,000 undocumented Central American aliens and placing them in military detention centers. This was all going to be done in conjunction with a U.S. military strike, which was codenamed Operation Night Train. So Rex 84 and Night Train were partner readiness exercises of a military strike into Central America and a massive mobilization inside the United States of the Defense Department, the National Guard, and the Federal Emergency Management Agency to round up all of these undocumented Central American aliens. Well, needless to say, we were quite distressed about this, though it explained where this peculiar theory was coming from that we had encountered down in southern Texas against the sanctuary movement. We began to investigate it further, and we discovered that there was a second readiness exercise being planned in conjunction with Rex 84 in addition to this hypothetical roundup of Central American aliens. This section of Rex 84 was to practice distributing military equipment inside the United States, from the Defense Department down to the state National Guard units, down to citizen groups that were going to be designated as state defense forces. They were going to be private civilian groups similar to the old auxiliary police of the civil defense. And they were going to be established by state legislation, and they were going to be the recipients of this military equipment during the readiness exercise. When we investigated that, we discovered that these state defense forces had been established in Texas, Louisiana, Alabama, and Virginia. And in these southern states, the people that were going in to sign up voluntarily for these citizen groups were members of the Soldiers of Fortune organizations and these survivalist training camp people from the weekend, these weekend warriors. And we were quite distressed by that as to what the implications were of these people being deputized during some sort of state of domestic emergency here in our country in conjunction with somehow arresting people that were viewed to be potential threats to the stability of our government because they resisted or would oppose the operation in Central America. Well, when we pursued the investigation further, we discovered that we shouldn't be so distressed, they said. These were some of the people involved in the National Guard unit, said, look it, because these weapons aren't going to be kept by these private citizens groups. What's going to happen is the weapons are going to be distributed to them, and once they receive them, the weapons are going to be revalued from their original manufacture cost up to their much higher replacement value. And at the end of the readiness exercise, the original dollar value of weapons is going to be collected again, which is going to leave many, many weapons out in the hands of these people, but they're not going to keep them. They're going to smuggle them to the Contras. Because by this time, we had come to the point where the Boland Amendment had been passed by the United States Congress prohibiting the executive branch of our government from giving any aid, direct or indirect, to the Contras. So you see, what we had discovered at the Christic Institute, totally inadvertently, by working on the sanctuary case, well, we had discovered a mechanism hidden inside the executive branch of our government under President Reagan and Ed Meese and Vice President Bush to smuggle military equipment to the Contras. And we discovered that Oliver North, a young lieutenant colonel in the National Security Council, was working through a private man by the name of Robert Owen, who was the liaison to these private network of people, this private enterprise, and that they were facilitating and allowing this type of operation to go on such that these private flights were not being stopped by Customs or by the Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms Division of Treasury. They were being allowed to fly out of our country in violation of all the laws, the Arms Export Control Acts, the customs laws, and, of course, the Federal Neutrality Act, which prohibits private groups like this from mounting military operations against a government with whom we have diplomatic relations. So that was the information that we were in possession of when we were first contacted by Martha Honey and Tony Avergan and asked to defend them in this federal libel trial down in Costa Rica. And during the process of that investigation, we discovered even more about the hierarchy of this private group. When we arrived in Costa Rica, the staff of the Christic Institute, to help work with Martha and Tony to prepare their defense, this is when we began to obtain information from Martha and Tony demonstrating that there was a massive drug smuggling operation going on out of John Hull's ranch, as well as the weapons smuggling that was going on. When we discovered that, we began to explore to try to determine who all of these people were in this private network. How high up did it go? What was the history of these people? It was at that point that we at the Christic Institute discovered some of the unique information which we brought to this investigation. And that was, we discovered from a former military intelligence officer who came forward to communicate with us about this, that in fact the leadership of this private enterprise wasn't really Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North. And it wasn't just some of these lower echelon people like Tom Posey from the Civilian Military Assistance Group, but that in fact the leadership of this private enterprise was in fact vested in a man by the name of Richard V. Secord, a man by the name of Albert Hakim, a man by the name of Eric von Marbod, and a man, most importantly, by the name of Theodore G. Shackley. Theodore Shackley, who's a man who was hidden in the shadows for many, many years. He was the director of all covert operations worldwide for the Central Intelligence Agency under George Bush, when Vice President George Bush was the director of the Central Intelligence Agency back in 1976. This was the group that had been in power right up until the time of the election of President Carter and this new reform regime of our government that in fact dismissed a lot of these men from our government. This is the information that we began to get, and the picture that it paints is one that is extraordinarily different than the picture that has been painted by the hearings that you have seen of the United States Congress, where the Congress and the others gave you the impression that somehow this whole private enterprise was just an ad hoc group that had been set up by Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North after October of 1984 to attempt to circumvent this one order of Congress telling the executive branch and the president that he couldn't give any support to the Nicaraguan Contras. That's the impression that all of us have, except it isn't true. That the operation was not set up by Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North. This operation had been in place for many, many years. In fact, when the Carter administration came to power, was elected in November of 1976, that the Carter administration between 1976 and 1980 functionally terminated the employment of 720 men that were part of the operational directorate, the Covert Operations Division of the Central Intelligence Agency, because the Carter administration had heard all the revelations of Senator Frank Church's Select Committee on Intelligence Abuse, the Watergate investigation, the Pike Commission, the Rockefeller Commission. They had discovered the counterintelligence program, spying on the United States citizens, the participation in that by Central Intelligence operatives under Operation Shamrock, it was called. And a major reform thrust evolved, as we all remember, under the Carter administration. And that administration forced from the government some 720 men, including the major leadership officers of the covert operations that had been engaged for so many years in what they call black operations, that are so secret that no one can know anything about them because they involve assassination, all types of criminal activities. They were simply pushed from the government, and that problem was swept under the rug by the Carter administration. The problem is that these men went outside of the government and set up a private operation based in a company called the Egyptian American Transport and Service Company, based in Egypt. And they began to establish contact with all of these extremely criminal regimes, such as Anastasio Somoza's and the others around the world that had been cut off from military supplies by the United States government under the Carter administration. And this secret enterprise, this private enterprise run by Theodore Shackley, Richard Secord, Albert Hakim, Edwin Wilson, and others, began to supply the military equipment to these dictators when they were cut off by American policy. Now, that's an extremely important fact to know, because when Anastasio Somoza, the dictator of Nicaragua, fell from power in July of 1979, his officials, military officials, met with members of this secret enterprise, agents of Theodore Shackley and Richard Secord and Albert Hakim and Rafael Quintero. They met with them, and an agreement was entered into whereby the secret team would continue to supply military equipment and all of the kind of supplies that Anastasio Somoza was being denied by the American people and by the American Congress and by the American presidency and by the Central Intelligence Agency. And these men are the ones who began to supply the equipment to Anastasio Somoza and others around the world, and indeed are the ones who helped create the Contras. And that is the operation that was set up by members of this secret team, this private enterprise, if you will, that was in place and operating when President Reagan came to power. When President came to power in the beginning of 1981, they simply turned control of the Contras over to the Central Intelligence Agency under Bill Casey. And they began to supply the equipment and do the training and the recruiting for the Contras. That went on, of course, until 1984, from 1981 to 1984, when the Contras were caught mining the harbors in Nicaragua, passing out the assassination manuals, advocating that private citizens such as doctors and teachers and bookkeepers and mayors be assassinated by the Contras inside Nicaragua. The American people rose up and Congress rose up at that time and passed the Boland Amendment, prohibiting the CIA and any other operatives of the president from giving any aid, direct or indirect, to the Contras. What was done at that time, of course, was the Reagan administration simply took the Contra operation and turned it back over to the private team, this secret enterprise that was going on, run by Theodore Shackley and Richard Secord and Tom Clines and the others. And so, but they left a military liaison to that secret team. That was Oliver North. Now, a big advance has been made now by the publication of Bob Woodward's book called Veil. And that at least demonstrates that this off-the-shelf, off-the-records operation was in fact established. And it was operating throughout the entire duration of the Reagan administration, from 1981 all the way up to 1986. and it gives details about the assassinations that were authorized, the kind of terrorist activities they engaged in, and trying to blame them on other terrorists and making up information to try to justify this re-establishing value in this black operations program to bring these people up out of exile, basically, to bring them back into the government to allow these types of covert operations to go on. That was what was really going on there. But Bob Woodward's book falls short in that it has a tendency to leave a false impression that this was all created by Bill Casey when he came in. The fact of the matter is that this private group of men who used to run the covert operations for the Central Intelligence Agency, when they'd been pushed out of the government by President Carter, as we pointed out, set up a completely private, non-governmental enterprise that ran these entire operations. And the fact of the matter is, these same men have been working in those kind of operations without obeying the law, violating international treaties, violating domestic American laws, and financing a portion of their secret operations with an alliance with the major narcotics smugglers out of Southeast Asia for some 20 years. And that this operation had been running without the knowledge of the Congress, without the supervision of the Congress, without the authorization of the President throughout the Carter administration. So this is, in fact, the true nature of the public policy problem with which we find ourselves faced now. It is not either the ad hoc setting up of a temporary group by Oliver North, nor is it just the fact that one single administration, or even just a Republican administration, has in fact allowed or set up a kind of off-the-shelf operation like this. What has happened here, you see, is that the entire covert operations department of our intelligence bureaucracy has gotten out of control. They have gotten so devoted to their purest ideas as to how they're going to enforce extremely radical policies throughout the world that they're not going to respond to the helm. When a president is elected that disagrees with them, they will not obey him. When a director of the Central Intelligence Agency comes to power, such as Stansfield Turner, who tries to stop them from doing it, they will not obey him. They go outside of our government and have set up this operation. Now, these men are the target of our lawsuit. And it's important to note that this lawsuit was filed not as a Johnny-come-lately after all of these things had been discovered. Our lawsuit was filed in May of 1986. This is 6 months before Eugene Hassenfuss's C-123 was shot down. 7 months before the Attorney General of the United States, Edwin Meese, got on television and announced that he discovered some surprising secret network going on. We had laid out in detail this information to the federal court in Miami. We named the names of the secret team. We told what role they had played, the longevity of their operations. In fact, as you may recall, during the televised hearings, Robert Dutton, one of the employees of Richard Secord, said that Oliver North and Richard Secord had come to the conclusion that the Christic Institute must have as their source of their information Felix Rodriguez, who was one of the major components of the secret team, who was the trans-shipping officer for the equipment to the Contras, because our information was so accurate and so detailed that he must be our source of this. Now, that's the kind of detailed information that the Christic Institute has. And we've been working very hard to share this information with the American people because it is transparent that the United States Congress does not really want to deal with this. Obviously, a Republican Party, which is embarrassed by these things, is afraid of being accused of exclusively being the ones who do this, because that is, of course, what the Democratic Party would like to do. The Democratic Party would like to obtain the benefit of just saying that, well, this was the Reagan administration, and see how either they were totally incompetent and negligent, or in fact they were willful, and therefore you should allow the Democratic Party to now take over control of the executive branch of government in our upcoming elections. Now, that's not to necessarily criticize the Democratic Party, because the purpose of the Democratic Party is not to right all of the wrongs in the world, but is merely to obtain political power for their people and their constituencies. The Republican Party, in the same way, you can't, in a certain sense, blame them for resisting this and trying to pretend that none of this is true, because they're afraid of having it unfairly all blamed on them. Whereas, in fact, if you really investigate it, as the Christic Institute has, you see that this has evolved under both Democratic and Republican administrations, this granting of excess power to this type of dark operations, allowing assassinations and alliances with drug smugglers so that money can be secretly funneled into these programs without Congress knowing where it is. That this has gone on under both Republican and Democratic administrations. And the fact is, we've tracked these exact same men all the way back to 1960, when in fact they were the very people who ran the ultra-secret war against Cuba. After the United States had said, oh no, we're not going to do that anymore, it was very embarrassing at the Bay of Pigs, we didn't really mean to do that, we aren't going to do that anymore, our president gave his word that he wasn't going to do this anymore, a secret operation called Operation Mongoose had been set up, run by Theodore Shackley as the CIA station chief in Miami. His director of training was Tom Clines. And they had in that group a special assassination unit that was assigned to assassinate Fidel Castro, Raul Castro, Che Guevara, and 5 other men in the political leadership of the Cuban government. On that assassination team was Felix Rodriguez, Jose Posada Correa, Rafael Chichi Quintero, 3 of the men who were intimately involved in the supply network for the Contras, working for Theodore Shackley and Tom Clines and Richard Secord. You see, this is a group of men who have been working together for many, many years under both Republican and Democratic administrations in the blackest of operations for the Central Intelligence Agency. And the reason that no one will expose them is because both the Democratic and Republican administrations are afraid that if they are prosecuted criminally for what they've done when they were in private practice, they're going to blackmail the government by threatening to reveal the exact same kind of conduct that they had engaged in for both Republican and Democratic presidents. And so all of the people in Washington here in the Republican and Democratic Party have said, look, let's not do this. Let's just, whatever comes out that is unavoidable, we'll accept that and define that as the nature of the problem here to our people. Our American people, I believe, know better than that. They know that they haven't been told the truth here. They know that there's only a partial truth has been communicated to us. They're not going to accept the final report of the Iran-Contra Committee of the United States Congress as anything other than a partial truth. In the same way that even though there was a lot of revealing information in the Tower Commission, when you have John Tower, the campaign manager for President Reagan in Texas, chairing that committee, they're not going to tell you everything. So we have a progression of information that has been revealed to us. And Sarah will review this in her closing statements, but the American people now have an opportunity to help, to solve this ultimate problem, to get at the real public policy problem which underlays this entire conspiracy and scandal that we're faced with here today. That, while it's been painful and uncomfortable to go through this process, we cannot sweep this problem under the rug. The fact is that since the time that we all passed the National Security Act of 1947, setting up the Central Intelligence Agency and the National Security Council, in authorizing them, both the Republican and Democratic Party under the Truman Doctrine, to go forth and try to find people that didn't agree with the American policies, that were either socialist or communist or too progressive or didn't agree with our policies, and to infiltrate their governments and neutralize them and topple their governments, that has been a policy decision. That now, in the 200th anniversary year of our Constitution, we're looking at the 40th anniversary year of that National Security Act of 1947. And it is high time that the new administration that is going to be coming to power in the elections of 1988 and the new Congress that is going to be elected have to look at that very, very seriously and reevaluate entirely what the structure is supposed to be, what the levels of authority are supposed to be, what the constitutional limitations are supposed to be. What we're caught in now is this kind of ad hoc way of attempting to adjust to it. Well, let's put together some intelligence committees. Oh, well, that didn't work, that didn't work too well, so let's have fewer people that have to be told about this, or more people that have to be. What we're doing is we're scrambling along without stopping and taking a careful look at what the implications of these policies really are. And we now have an opportunity, unique in the last 40 years, I believe, to look at this problem. So in the final analysis, I think that the image that is important for us to keep in mind is that The members of Congress who oppose this investigation, and members of the administration, and members of the private intelligence organizations and the intelligence community are trying to convince the American people that this problem that has been revealed during this past summer is nothing more serious than just a small cancerous nodule on the nose of one single president. Whereas in fact what we have discovered is that there is a cancer that is deep in the chest of our American body politic, that there are indications that there may even be monies coming in out of these secret funds into our country to put into PACs secretly to attack individual senators and congressmen who do not support the financing of the Contras or the other kind of extremist programs that these people want to have. Now, these men will try to tell us that our American body politic is not strong enough, basically, to undergo this type of serious surgery that needs to be undertaken. That why don't we, like other people in other families, when they discover that the head of their household has cancer, pretend that it's not true. Wish that it's not true and that maybe it'll go away. Or that let's avoid having to go through this kind of disruptive process to analyze what the disease is and have it exculpated. But these are the men that don't trust in our government institutions anyhow. They don't believe in allowing the Congress to oversee what they're doing. They don't believe in allowing the American people to pass judgment on what it is that they're doing. They believe that they are the experts that know, and that they therefore are not the proper people to whom to listen when they try to tell us not to go near this information and not to dig into it. We as the American people know very well that we're proud of our country, we have lots of confidence in our democratic system, and that we're not afraid to admit mistakes that have been made. And we're not even afraid to admit the role that we played in allowing some of those terrible things to happen. And that is the thing for which our country can be proud, and that we can dare in the next generation to stand proudly before the world and say, we faced this problem, we have exculpated this problem, and we want your respect and your assistance in making this whole world a much better place for us to live in and for our children to live in. Thank you very much.
There are people all over the country in their homes watching this program and learning about this information, which is very serious and sobering, and yet it's also hopeful, because we have this window of opportunity now in the country to uncover this information, to share it with the American people, to take it into a court of law, to verify the facts, and then to work together throughout the country to raise up the facts and put the kind of pressure that will be necessary on our institutions to collectively solve these policy programs. We cannot do this without your help. We can do the investigation and the litigation, but we need your help in a number of ways. First of all, financially, this is very expensive, and we are a tax-deductible organization, nonprofit, and we're dependent on the support of citizens throughout the country, of religious organizations and foundations. And we would very much appreciate your support. If you can help us, please send us contributions to our Washington office. Also, we are working with organizations throughout the country to help communicate this information. There are 50 national groups that collectively have 130 million members, and these organizations are helping us disseminate the information so that we can reach more people. And together we are working out different kinds of action programs that we can collectively create the groundswell to create the pressure on our institutions. And in that way, we need your help. If you're part of an organization that would like to be part of our Communications Alliance, please let us know, and we'll put our organizers in touch with the people in your organization who can make those kinds of decisions. We have information, we have packets of in-depth information on the drugs and other issues. Please contact us if we can be at all helpful to you. Thank you very much.
For more information or to contribute to the Christic Institute's investigational lawsuit, write or call us at the Christic Institute, 1324 North Capitol Street Northwest, Washington, D.C., 20002. Our phone number is area code 202-797-8106. That's 202-797-8106. To get the whole story behind the scandal, send $10 for a copy of our court affidavit that outlines the major findings of our lawsuit.